Hey everyone, this is Riddle Hagaraja Raven. I'm here with my recap and review of the Gilded Age season number 1, episode number 4, which is titled The Long Ladder. Now, first of all, congratulations to the Gilded Age fans, myself included. The show has been renewed by HBO. It will be coming back for season number 2, and we are only 4 episodes in, so I guess it's doing numbers, and I'm here for it. I'm here for it. I wasn't expecting the Gilded Age to be as enjoyable that it ended up as it ended up being, but yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where Julian Fellows ends up taking all of the characters and how he continues to explore New York during the Gilded Age era. But anyway, coming back to the episode, it opens up with Mr. Morris's funeral. Mrs. Morris is there. There are other two people there, and I think some of the people, because I think they know that he ended up taking his own life, so there's this woman who ends up saying that should he be buried on sacred ground, and I'm like, okay, okay. So there's a bit of apprehension, I guess, when it comes to where Mr. Morris has will be buried, and I think that his death again, he ended up taking his own life because of what Robert basically did to him, and the rest of the aldermen. Not Robert, George. Yeah, my bad. George Russell ended up doing to him, and yeah, he is dead, and people know that he took his own life. And while we get a scene of the funeral, it jumps back and forth between the scene of Mr. Russell's plans for the train station that he wants to build. So basically, with Mr. Morris being being put to rest and being buried and all of that stuff, Mr. Russell is very happy about his plans moving forward. So Bertha walks into the room, and this is where she ends up talking to her husband about Mr. Morris's death and and yeah, George ends up feeling a bit of guilt. He's like, you know what? Mr. Morris ended up taking his own life because of what I did to him, and Bertha's like, no, no, don't blame yourself. He was weak, you were strong. He couldn't fight the game. You're still here, so keep on moving forward. And then these two have a talk about what to do with Gladys, because apparently, yeah, Bertha is going to fire her current caretaker, her current nanny, because I guess Gladys isn't being controlled by her, and especially because in the previous episode we saw that Gladys ended up going to meet someone called Archie or Archibald or something. And yeah, I guess Berta ended up learning about it, and she's like, you know what? I'm going to fire the nanny. And Robert and George is very happy to hear it. He's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense because Gladys is a grown woman. And Berta's like, you misunderstood me. I'm going to hire another nanny. I'm still not going to give her the lady's maid because Gladys is still a child. And I'm like, Berta, why are you doing this? And yeah, even Berta is like, you know what? George, I'm thinking of a better future for my daughter, and if you want a better future for your daughter as well, you need to support me. Then we cut to Marian and Peggy. They're walking on the street. They're looking at some shops, and this is where Peggy ends up telling Marian that she ended up getting a request for a meeting from a person called T. Thomas. T. Thomas, who was it? Let me remember. T. Thomas Fortune, which yeah, Timothy Thomas Fortune, who was a real life person in charge of the New York Globe, and yeah, you can look him up. You can Google him. He's there. And Peggy is like, you know what, I have a meeting with him, and Miriam is very happy about it. And as they're walking, Miriam notices a shop that she wants to go into, and Peggy is like, let's not go in there. And again, the world that Peggy lives in and the world that Miriam lives in, these are two very different worlds, and we do get to see the writers handle that racial tension. Later on in the episode. So also before they go into the shop, these two also talk about Mr. Rikes, and Peggy is like, okay, so what did you decide about Mr. Rikes? Are you going to say yes to his proposal or whatnot? And Miriam is like, I'm not even sure if he proposed. And Peggy is like, would you have liked him to propose? And then Peggy asks Miriam if what her answer would be if her aunts didn't exist. And yeah, Miriam, I think Miriam is kind of okay with marrying Mr. Rakes, but let's see how that goes, especially after how this episode ended up. But anyway, in the shop, they end up meeting Mrs. Chamberlain, and she's here to pick up a jewelry box, I guess, a wooden carved jewelry box. And while that's happening, Peggy is standing a few feet away, and she's noticing that the owner of the shops and the other employees at the shop, they're eyeing her suspiciously because of the color of her skin, of course, and they don't necessarily want her in such a shop. And Mrs. Chamberlain notices that as well, and she ends up calling Peggy to come closer, interact with her, and all of that stuff. And Miriam ends up introducing Peggy to Mrs. Chamberlain, introducing her as a secretary to her aunt. And Peggy looks at the carved jewelry box, and she's like, yes, that's very beautiful. So this is where Midian is like, okay, so I'm here to buy a shawl. Why don't I pay for the shawl, and then we'll walk out of the shop on our own? And Mrs. Chamberlain is like, no, Then people would think that we ended up going to this little shopping trip planned. I don't want that for you, because I think, yeah, Mrs. Chamberlain is very aware of her reputation in high society, and I guess even though she wants to be friends with Miriam, she doesn't want Miriam's image to be tarnished by being close to her and all of that stuff. But anyway, after the little meeting, Peggy is like, Miriam, we have to go. We need to go. And yeah, they leave. They leave. Again, this entire scene just showed that Miriam is basically oblivious to the type of experiences that Peggy has. So we cut to the house, the Van Ryan house, and Agnes decides Ada. Ada ends up asking Barrister to walk Pumpkin, and Barrister's like, yeah, no one else is here right now, so I'll do it for you. And then we cut to George Russell, and he ends up talking to Mr. Fane, and he's like, Mr. Fane, you know what? I'm not angry at you anymore. I don't want to punish you. And Mr. Fane is like, are you all right? I'm not really sure if I can trust you. And yeah, George is like, no, you can trust me. And is the bill going to is going to be passed? And Mr. Fane is like, yep, it will be. So basically, George is trying to mend his relationship with the rest of the aldermen, and he also wants something in return, which again we'll get to in a bit. So it turns out that while Barrister was walking Pumpkin, there was a dog, not a dog, there was a horse who was a bit agitated. And yeah, while Barrister was focused on the horse, Pumpkin ran away, and there's no collar around Pumpkin's neck either. And of course, Ada is very, very disappointed. She's very sad because she's like, what if a thief ends up kidnapping Pumpkin and sells him off for like $50 or whatnot? And Agnes is like, you know what, Ada, just calm down. People on the street recognize that Pumpkin belongs to us. Someone will bring her over. So while that's happening, we see Jack trying to interact with Bridget again. And Jack is like, Bridget, what's wrong? Did I do something wrong? Because if you remember in the previous episode, their little date didn't go well. And yeah, Bridget is like, no, it's not you, Jack. It's just that you didn't do anything wrong. It's just that I'm not looking for a relationship right now. I guess she didn't necessarily say that, but those were the vibes I was getting from her. And you can clearly see that there's something bothering Bridget, which we do get to learn about later on in the episode. So we cut to the Russell house, and this is where Berta ends up firing Gladys's nanny, because Berta ended up opening a letter, and she ended up learning about how the nanny took Gladys to meet a young man in broad daylight. And yeah, the nanny is like, well, she's a young woman. These things happen. And Berta is like, not on my watch. So we cut to the Fane house, and I have to say, the actor who plays Mr. Fane, I'm not really sure if he's supposed to be old or if he's supposed to be quite young, because sometimes he looks older, sometimes he looks young. I'm not really sure what's happening with his face. But yeah, but he looks good. He looks good. So this is where Mr. Fane ends up telling his wife about Russell's offer, and that Russell is willing to save them from bankruptcy. They won't have to sell the house and all of that, and live off on Mrs. Fane's father, charity from Mrs. Fane's father. And Mrs. Fane is like, okay, so what's the catch? What does he want in return? And Mr. Fane is like, well, he's very annoyed that his wife isn't being welcome in high society. So I want you to do that. And Mrs. Fane is like, oh, that's a very big ask of him. And yeah, Mr. Fane is like, you have to do it. You have to do it if you want us to save our money. And Mrs. Fane is like, you know what? I'll try. I'll see what we can do. So it's time for Gladys to say goodbye to her nanny, and then he's like, you know what, even though I was your jailer for a couple of years, here's to hoping I was also your friend. And this is where they end up noticing Pumpkin all dirty on the street. And yeah, one of the help ends up picking Pumpkin up, and as she's picking her up, this is where she ends up noticing Mr. Watson going out for one of his walks. And yeah, we get to see there's a bit of mystery surrounding Mr. Watson for some reason. So let's see what that ends up resulting in. So Berta walks out, and she's like, "Okay, bye bye, nanny." And this is where Gladys is like, "Oh, look who the dog look at the dog that we found. Doesn't he look familiar? And it doesn't the dog belong to the Van Ryan house? Should I go and take the dog with me and give the dog back to its owners?" And Berta is like, "Yeah, I recognize that dog, but you know what? You won't do such a thing." And she asks her help to take the dog, give it a bath, give it some food, and then have a letter be sent to the Van Ryan household about them finding Pumpkin. So as she's, I still don't remember this woman's name, but yeah, as she's walking into the kitchen, Bruce, Mrs. Bruce, I guess her name's Mrs. Bruce. I could be wrong, but yeah, as Mrs. Bruce is walking in the kitchen, another young girl asks her about whether or not Gladys is going to have a proper lady's maid or another nanny. But yeah, even the help know that Gladys is a grown woman and her mother doesn't necessarily let her be free. So this is where we end up seeing Peggy going to the publication office, the New York Globe, and she ends up meeting Mr. Fortune. I guess I'll call him Mr. Fortune. Timothy Fortune. But yeah, he's quite good, handsome, he's quite good looking, and of course, he ends up flirting a bit with Peggy. He's very impressed by her writing, and he's like, you know what, Peggy, your story that you wrote, that's amazing, and we'll publish it in next week's newspaper. And Peggy ends up saying something about politics, about why should she align herself to with Democrats or Republicans when she doesn't have the right to vote, and that interests Mr. Fortune as well, because he's like, I like how Peggy thinks. She's someone who's outspoken, and then he asks her to write 200 words about her thoughts on politics. So yeah, this is happening, and I'm here for it. So yeah, Agnes ends up reading the Van Ryan's note, and she is livid. She's like, there's no way that we are going to personally go to the Russell's house, and not the Van Ryan note, the note sent to the Van Ryans from the Russells. So yeah, she reads the note, and she's like, there's no reason, there's no way that I'm going to go. I'm going to personally go to the Russell's house to retrieve Pumpkin. And Ada is like, well, I can do that, and Marian is like, yeah, I don't mind, and Agnes is like, no, 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 I'm not going to allow a mere dog serve as a link between the two households. So I'll send Barrister, and Barrister can go and bring Pumpkin. So this is where Bridget ends up talking to the head cook, and yeah, even the head cook is like, well, you won't be having any romance in your life if you keep on ignoring Jack. Even your mother would think so. And Bridget is like, yeah, of course she would think that. So yeah, there's definitely something going on with Bridget and her mom. Then we cut to Mr. Watson, and he's kind of hiding behind a tree, and he's noticing this woman walking out of the carriage, and she's going into a rich house. So I guess he's connected to her somehow. Maybe she's her daughter, ex-wife, ex-fiance, sister, I don't know. But I'm interested in finding out. So this offered a bit of comedy in the episode where Barrister ends up going to the Van Ryan house, and who was it? The name of the head person in the Van Ryan house. Not the Van Ryan house, Russell. Why do I keep saying Van Ryan? I have no idea. So yeah, the head person in the at the Russell's house, he ends up offering Mr. Barrister a tour of the house. He gives him a tour of the kitchen, and he ends up meeting the French chef. And yeah, this is where Mr. Barrister, as he's going through the menu, he's like, oh, soup, you're serving soup for luncheon. Is it cold soup? But no, it's hot soup. So basically, the way that the Russells do things, it's very, very different from how Barrister ends up doing things. And that kind of makes the cook and the head help person over at the Russell's house a bit insecure. So we cut to Peggy telling Marian about her meeting with Mr. Fortune, and she's very happy that Mr. Fortune offered her to write a political piece as well. And Agnes walks in, and she's like, okay, what's this I'm hearing about? A political piece? You know what? I'm happy that you ended up getting the opportunity to have your story printed. But if you do print a political piece, just make sure that I don't get to learn about it. And yeah, apparently Peggy is going to go this Friday to her parents' house, and Agnes is like, yeah, go. And also don't tell your parents about you writing a political piece. Yeah, she's like, they won't want that kind of trouble. So again, a bit of more comedy where Barrister goes over the table setting, and he's like, ooh, what's this? What's that? Why is this placed here this way? Why not like that? So basically, there's a difference between how the British do stuff and how the Americans do stuff. So as the aunts and Marian are sitting down, this is where Mrs. Fane's invitation comes in, and Agnes hands it over to Marian about Mrs. Fane inviting her to this Academy of Music thing, and that she needs to go, and that she should go. And Marian is like, yeah, I can do that. And while they're talking, there's a delivery for Marian, and it turns out that Mrs. Chamberlain ended up sending Marian the carved jewelry box that she bought from the store. And Agnes is like, who the heck sent you that? And Marian is like, do you really want to know? Now, as far as Agnes is concerned, she's like, you know what, is that Mr. Rakes? Did Mr. Rakes send you that gift? And if you don't tell me, you can't keep it in the house. And Marian is like, you know what, then I won't keep it in the house. And again, I can't promise you, Aunt Agnes, that I won't end up marrying someone or seeing a suitor that you think that isn't who isn't suitable for me. I can't promise you that. So we cut to the Russells having dinner, and this is where Mr. Russell ends up telling Berta that she needs to get ready because Mrs. Swain probably sent her an invitation, and Berta's like, yeah, I got an invitation, and I'm not really sure what she wants to talk to me about. And Mr. Russell was like, maybe she wants you to be part of a charity, and I'm like, because it's Mr. Russell who ended up telling Mr. Russell to. It was Mr. Russell who ended up telling Mr. Fane to tell his wife to basically include Berta into society and all of that stuff. And Berta's like, okay, I think I can handle that. So after dinner is done, Mr. Russell and Larry are walking out, and this is where they kind of discuss Oscar because Oscar, after what Mr. Morris told him about Russell's basically going bankrupt, Oscar ended up stepping away from the Russells, and yeah, Mr. Russell doesn't like that, and he's like, Larry, tell me, do you really think that he's after Gladys? And Larry is like, well, if he is after Gladys, what's wrong in it? He has a name, he has a position, he has a bit of money, so he's a good catch. And Mr. Russell was like, I don't think so. So we cut to the kitchen over at the Russell's house, and yeah, the head person and the cook are having a discussion because, again, Mr. Barrister's visit ended up making them feel a bit insecure about how they run things. So as everyone is walking away to do their duties, this is where the cook ends up stopping Miss Turner, and he's like, Miss Turner, why are you always angry, huh? And Miss Turner's like, well, it's because I'm wasting my life here. And the cook is like, well, if you feel that you're wasting your life, then you should either leave or you should change things. And she's like, that's exactly what I've planned. I'm going to change things. So Ada goes to talk to Marian about who sent her the gift, and yeah, this is where Marian tells Ada that it was Mrs. Chamberlain, and Ada's like, oh, that's bad, you need to return it. And then these two talk about Mr. Rikes, and yeah, Ada's like, Marian, I will always try and be your friend, but tread carefully. Don't do something that Agnes wouldn't approve of. And Marian ends up asking Ada about whether or not if she ever fell in love. And Ada's like, yeah, I did, but it was years ago. I was very young, but father ended up refusing to go ahead with the proposal because he didn't think that that particular person was suitable enough for me. And Marian is like, well, have you ever imagined what your life would have been? Would you have been happier if you had married the person that you loved? And Ada's like, that's a very cruel question, Marian, to ask me. And I understand that Marian didn't intend it to be cruel, but it did come across a bit like that. And Ada's like, I might not be as strong as Agnes, but I still have a heart, I still have feelings and all of that stuff, and I still know things. Okay, Marian? So just promise me that you will be careful. And Marian's like, yeah, I guess so. So Marian ends up, it's the next day, and Marian ends up taking the jewelry box to Mrs. Chamberlain's house. And even though her aunt told her to hand the box to one of the footmen outside the house, Marian decides to go inside the house. And yeah, Mrs. Chamberlain is very, very rich. She has these art pieces. She's a collector and all of that stuff. So, and they talk about Mr. Chamberlain, and Marian is like, how did you guys meet? And that question doesn't sit well with Mrs. Chamberlain. And Marian's like, yeah. I'll ask another question. So she asks a bit more about Mr. Chamberlain, and yeah, Mrs. Chamberlain is like, well, he was a widower, and when his wife died, I ended up meeting him, and then he had money, he had all of the reputation and all of that stuff, but I'm the one who ended up teaching him how to actually live and actually use the money. Basically, kind of like what Berta is doing with George, I guess. But yeah, kind of not the same, but there's a similarity. And yeah, Mrs. Chamberlain is very appreciative of Marian taking the time to come meet her at the house. And she's like, you know what, I know that you can't stay long, but the carved box is still yours. I will treat it as if it's your possession that I have in my house, and you're invited to come whenever you want to see it. So we cut to Berta and Mrs. Fane talking, and Mrs. Fane is like, you know what, your husband has been very kind to us, and I would like to repay the favor. So I would like to work with you to get you into society. And Berta is like, I guess this can work. And yeah, Mrs. Fane is like, let's start small, and I'll invite you to the Academy of Music thing. So let's get this working, and I'll also tell the other women in the circles that we are friends now. So as Bertha is walking into the office, George is talking to his, I guess, his right-hand man about how one of the factories. Now, I could be totally wrong because I couldn't necessarily understand the conversation, but I think that one of the factories it got damaged or something. There was an accident. A whole lot of people died, and yeah, George doesn't want that to happen to his workers. And he's like, I want you to check the security and safety and all of that stuff. And Bertha walks in and she's like, you know what? What will actually benefit us if we end up supporting a charity that deals in such accidents and disasters? And then she ends up talking about the Red Cross branch and all of that stuff. And George is like, yep, that can work. And it will help increase the reputation of my company, my business. And it will also help you, Bertha, to get into the higher circles. And she's like, yep, let's do this. So we cut to Oscar, and he's talking to Aunt Ada about how he made a mistake. He ended up believing Mr. Morris when he said that the Russells are going to bankrupt, and he ended up stepping away from the Russells. And now Oscar is like, you know what? I have to get back into that house. I have to find a way to get back into that house. And while they're talking, Marian comes in, and Marian ends up telling Ada and Oscar that she ended up meeting Mrs. Chamberlain. And this is where we get to learn a bit more about Mrs. Chamberlain. So it turns out that Mr. and Mrs. Chamberlain, they met each other while Mr. Chamberlain was still married to his first wife. And yeah, they ended up living in sin for a whole lot of years until his Mr. Chamberlain's first wife died. And they also had a son out of wedlock, but then Mrs. Chamberlain lied, and she said that she had been married before. And her son was from her first marriage, not from Mr. Chamberlain. But then as the son grew up, he ended up being a spitting image of Mr. Chamberlain. And I guess that's why he doesn't want to get involved in the society, and that's why he's living in Chicago. So yeah, it will be very interesting to see if Mrs. Chamberlain's son does return to Chicago, and he might end up liking Marian. So that could be an interesting thing that could happen. But yeah, let's see. And while they're talking, this is where Agnes walks in, and of course they change the subject. And yeah, they change the subject to this new ship going to Brooklyn, and how it will be very convenient for people who want to go to Brooklyn. And Marian is like, yeah, I'll be going to Brooklyn to surprise a friend. So it's nighttime, and this scene, Miss Turner is very, very, like, she has confidence for days. She's like, I'm going to change my destiny. So she decides to just walk into George's room. She takes off her robe. She's naked. And yeah, she decides to get into bed with him. And I'm like, please don't do what I think you're going to do, writers. Please don't do it. And I'm actually very glad that that didn't happen. But yeah, before we get to that particular scene, Bridget ends up telling the head cook about her past. So from what I can understand, her mom allowed her father to abuse her. And that ended up causing a lot of trauma for Bridget and her mistrust when it comes to other men. And I think she realizes that it doesn't make sense to mistrust Jack, but she has her guard up. But yeah, I think that the head cook will help her heal, and Jack will be understanding. But let's see what happens here. So yeah, it turns out that even though Mrs. Turner is very, very willing to hook up with George Russell, George is like, what the heck are you doing? And yeah, then we get an entire spiel from Miss Turner about how a man like George needs a woman who thinks of him and who pays attention to him, because Bertha apparently doesn't pay attention to her wifely duties to her husband. And George is like, I see where you're coming from, but you made one mistake. And that's one mistake, is that you didn't realize that I actually love my wife. Now get the heck out of my bed. And yeah, I was like, okay, so is he going to fire Miss Turner? But now it turns out that he's like, you know what, my wife likes you. She trusts you. So you will continue doing your duties to my wife, but we will never speak of this again. And I'm like, because I think that for a woman like Miss Turner, she might end up trying again, but let's see. So we cut to Peggy's house, and it turns out that she's from a well-off family. She has her own help. She has she has money. She came from money. And yeah, this is where they end. She's here to celebrate her mom's birthday, and this is where all of them are talking. And yeah, this is where Peggy's mom tells Peggy about a young man called Paul who graduated from Harvard Medical School and all of that stuff. And she's very interested in having him meet Peggy. And Peggy's like, "Well, mom, but I'm not really back, right?" I'm still working for the Van Rhijn and I'm working on my writing. And she ends up telling about her parents about the opportunity she got for her story to be published in the New York Globe. And that makes her mother very, very happy. But her father is like, but you won't be making much pay working for the New York Globe, huh? I want you to come work for me. So basically, her father runs a pharmacy and he wants to leave the pharmacy to Peggy. And yeah, but Peggy, that's the life that Peggy doesn't want. Well, yeah, as they're talking, it turns out that a friend that Marian wanted to surprise, it was Peggy, and she's like, oh, this address doesn't make sense. And she's in a black neighborhood. And yeah, she ends up arriving at the house uninvited. And of course, that surprises Peggy and her parents. And yeah, Arthur, I think Peggy's father's name is Arthur, right? But yeah, Mr. Scott is like, who the heck are you? And why are you in my house uninvited? And yeah, this is where Peggy ends up introducing Marian to her family. And she's like, okay, Marian, so why the heck are you here? And she's like, well, I brought you a gift. I brought you a surprise. And yeah, it turns out that the surprise that she bought were used shoes because apparently Marian thought that Peggy could use used shoes, hand me downs, and wow, Marian, wow. And of course, Peggy's parents feel insulted, and Peggy tries to handle the situation, but yeah, it's bad. It's just bad, and Peggy is angry at Marian too, and yeah, it's just bad. And they take their leave, and Peggy goes, and Marian follows, and yeah, Mrs. Scott isn't happy about how how her husband treated her daughter, and her husband is like, well, our responsibility is to raise a child who knows the difference between good and wrong, and I can't pretend to play happy families. And she's like, of course you can't. And she just storms up the stairway. Now, this is a moment. Now, this is a scene that occurred between Marian and Peggy, and I think that it was well written because this was basically a reality check to Marian about how the world that Marian lives in and the world that Peggy lives in, they are very, very different. And yeah, Peggy is like, just because I'm a black woman, you really thought that I was poor, huh? 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 And Marian is like, I'm sorry, I apologize, and all of that stuff. And yeah, Peggy's like, you know what, Marian? You know what I want you to do? I want you to stop pretending that you're actually my friend. And wow, wow. I'm looking forward to seeing how Marian is going to apologize to Peggy and how that's going to change Peggy's perspective when it comes to the black experience living in New York back in the day. But yeah, again, we didn't necessarily get any of this in the Downton Abbey series by Julian Fellows, but he's really exploring all of that in Gilded Age, and I'm here for it. So it's time for Bertha to leave for the Academy of Music, and yeah, George is like, didn't I see the escape on you before? And she's like, yeah, you did, but I can't be late, so I have to go. And he ends up ignoring Miss Turner, and yeah, Miss Turner, I think she's going to try again, but let's see. So everyone's there. They're enjoying the music. It's Bertha, Marian, Mr. and Mrs. Fane are sitting in one box, and after the performance is done, this is where Bertha tells her plans about how she wants to support the Red Cross branch and all of that stuff because the Red Cross, I forgot to mention this, but the charity that they wanted to work with that would be able to handle accidents that happen, that was going to be the Red Cross branch. And Mrs. Fane is like, that's a good plan. That can really work in our favor. So it turns out that Mr. Rikes is here as well. He was sitting in the booth next to where Marian was sitting, and yeah, Marian ends up introducing him to everyone, and then everyone leaves. And this is where Rakes and sits with Marian, and he's like, wow, look at me. I'm just climbing the ladder, aren't I? A few weeks ago, I didn't know anyone in New York, but look at me. Because apparently he ended up, I'm not really sure what happened. He ended up going to school with a person from a rich family, and that's how he ended up working that in order to be here. And I'm like, Rakes is smart. Rakes is smart. I think Rakes is doing all of this so that Marian's aunts will approve of him, but let's see how that pans out. So yeah, this is the woman that invited Rakes to the performance. She is like, Mr. Rakes, I want you to come back because I need to introduce you to another young woman. And Mr. Rakes takes his leave, and he's like, you know what, write to me, Marian, if you ever want to talk to me. So Bertha comes in and she's very impressed by Mr. Rakes because I think she can see who Mr. Rakes is, a person who didn't necessarily come from a named family and a lot of money, and how he's using his own intelligence to climb the ladder. But Bertha warns Marian, and she's like, you know what? Even he seems to be enjoying all of this, but he won't be able to keep all of this up if he doesn't have money, and that concerns Marian because if Mr. Rakes is going for out for money, then he might end up having a young rich girl fall for him because he is very charming if you think about it. And yeah, that concerns Marian because Marian doesn't necessarily have money. And the next performance starts, and Mr. Rakes and Marian, they look at each other for a second, and then Mr. Rakes focuses back on the girl, the young girl that's sitting next to him, and I'm like, oh, Marian, are you growing a bit jealous? Are you feeling a bit jealous? And yeah, the episode ends with Marian basically saying that she's into listening to songs as long as they have a happy ending. So let's see if Marian and Mr. Rake's storyline has a happy ending or not. But yeah, this was episode number 4 of the Gilded Age season number 1. Again, I'm very excited that this show has already been renewed for a second season. Let me know what you thought of the episode down in the comment section below. And until next time, stay happy, stay safe, stay blessed. See you guys later. Bye.